What's up, everyone? It's Brian from Exact Cybersecurity. Today, we're going to talk about risk assessments, what they are, why you should do them, and how you can get them done in your business. We're going to talk about that today. All right, so risk assessments in cybersecurity. What are they? But risk assessments in cybersecurity is the process of identifying, evaluating, and prioritizing potential cybersecurity risks to an organization's information systems, assets, and data. The goal of the risk assessment is to identify vulnerabilities and potential threats that could impact confidentiality, integrity, and availability and recoverability of an organization's data and assets. During the cybersecurity risk assessments, organizations will identify, assess the likelihood and potential impact of various threats and vulnerabilities such as malware attacks, phishing, data breaches, and based on this assessment, an organization can then prioritize the risks and develop a plan to mitigate or manage them. So for me, this risk assessments are the most important part of what you're doing around cybersecurity. If you don't do this step, if you skip risk assessments and you just start doing things like putting tools in place, multi-factor authentication, password managers, vulnerability scanners, and vulnerability management systems, whatever you pick, whatever the flavor of the month is, or whatever the cyber insurance company regulators are telling you to do right now because it's the new thing that they figured out recently and you got to do this now. We see it with cyber insurance. They're kind of making everybody do MFA right now, and a lot of them are starting to move in the direction of making companies have things like security operations centers, or at least outsourcing some of that to an outside company who's looking at things for you. We're starting to see a lot of this products and services being thrown in to businesses, and they're being forced to do these things. Risk assessments really help you take a step back and say, okay, where are we at today? What do we actually need to do? What are our vulnerabilities and what are our risks? And what makes the most sense to invest in, and when and why? That's really where the risk assessment is going to lead you with the data that it provides you if done correctly. Risk assessments usually involve quite a few steps, and some of the things that are looked at when you do a risk assessments are your assets. Identifying the assets in the business. What are the critical systems, applications, and data that this business needs to run? Now, a lot of people think of these risk assessments as just to deal with cyber criminals and ransomware, and that's not the case at all. Risk assessments should be looked at in terms of the business, not just the IT. Yes, the IT is a primary function, and a lot of this is driven because of IT. It's why it's called a risk assessment in cybersecurity, is because many people didn't even think about this stuff until things like cybersecurity came along. There's always been disaster recovery and business continuity concerns for businesses, but they've been magnified with the advent and the success of cyber criminals and ransomware. So businesses need to do a lot more today to protect themselves from a lot more threats, maybe than they did 10 years ago. And that has brought these conversations to the forefront when many businesses weren't having them at all, and many businesses were not doing a good enough job around them. And that's still, in my opinion, the case today. There's a lot of improvement for U.S. businesses to be made here, and hopefully you'll use videos like this to try to figure out what you should be doing in your business. So asset identification is kind of step number one, in my opinion, when it comes to this stuff, because you have to know what you need to protect and what's critical and what's not, because later on, as you develop the plan and put incident response plans in place and business continuity plans in place, you're going to want to do things in a particular order and not treat everything the same if you want to have a successful recovery from an unfortunate event. The other thing that a risk assessment will do for you is threat identification. That's number two here. This part goes through and identifies things like potential threats to the organization, what information systems may be potentially attacked by cyber criminals, or what could be taken offline in a fire or a flood, a hurricane, or some kind of natural disaster that takes systems offline. Where are the threats if we lose the critical assets that we identified in step one? Malware could be a threat. Phishing could be a threat. Social engineering attacks could also be a threat. And a full threat analysis is what you want a good risk assessment to cover for you. The next thing is vulnerability identification. This is number 3 on my list. Do you want to make sure that your risk assessment has vulnerability identification capabilities where it can scan your network devices, your computers, for vulnerable software and hardware that may exist in your environment that hackers just love to take advantage of if they can get into your network by maybe breaking down the front door through a brute force attack or getting your users to click on a phishing link. So you're going to want to make sure you can identify these potential weaknesses. Unpatched software would be one thing that's a vulnerability. Another thing would be poor password hygiene in your organization. If you're not using things like password managers and properly securing passwords and also creating passwords that are secure. And then systems that are misconfigured. Look, IT people, their job is to make things work, to make things run. And sometimes they don't think about security when they're doing their job every day, and they may leave something open or exposed. That's why you always want to make sure that you're identifying these misconfigured systems along the way. And risk assessments in cybersecurity are not a one-time thing. Yes, you can purchase them as a one-time thing, but best practices and what we recommend are that you do these on a regular basis. And a lot of regulations that we're seeing are echoing the same thing, that you need to have at least an annual risk assessment, if not quarterly, depending on your regulations and what you're up against. The next thing you need to do is you need to look for, number 4 is a risk analysis. And your risk analysis is going to assess the likelihood and potential impact each identified threat and vulnerability. So like I said, you're not going to want to treat everything equal. Some vulnerabilities, if a hacker is able to exploit them, some of them may not do a lot of damage at all. And some of them, they may be able to take over your whole entire network depending on the severity level of the vulnerability. You don't want to treat things equally. And also your data, some data that you have is way more important than others. In most businesses, you have employees and you have employee data, and that data is very valuable to a cyber criminal. You don't want to treat your employee data the same way that you treat, say, your marketing brochures that you have stored on your files. So keep that in mind, that you want to make sure that you're looking at each risk and then you're prioritizing that risk. And that's number 5, is you want to make sure that your risk assessment includes some risk prioritization. Which risks are more important than others in the business? And once you get through that process of identifying these risks, you want to make sure that, number 6, you have a mitigation plan in place. How are you going to mitigate or manage the identified risks before they become a problem for you? This may be a plan that you follow over many years, and it will also be a plan based on experience that you will have to change and you will have to modify over time. So risk mitigation is really just your roadmap to how you're going to fix all the problems that were identified. And I always recommend that when you go about this, you kind of take a page out of the credit industry and knock off the hard ones first. You know, it's called the snowball effect. You want to look at your biggest ones and you want to take those down first, and then maybe some of your smaller ones that are easy, you can hit those too. But you certainly don't want to, when it comes to cybersecurity, you don't want to leave your biggest threats out there. You want to do something about them. You want to isolate them, or you want to patch them or take care of them as quickly as you can, or, you know, in other words, you want to remediate it. So by doing an assessment and having an assessment done in the way that I laid it out is going to give you a leg up on most businesses that are out there, and it's certainly going to give you a leg up on your cybersecurity practices and make you more secure, which makes you a less attractive target to cyber criminals. And hopefully with you doing all of this, they move on to a target that's easier to hit, because that's the name of the game today. You make it easy for them, they're going to hit you. You make it hard for them, even just a little bit hard, they may move on to another target depending on what you have. Not always true, but that's kind of the rule of thumb. And the way that I look at things is we see tons and tons of businesses get hit with cyber attacks and ransomware, and it's usually because they're not doing much at all. It's not because they're doing some things. It's not because they're usually not doing much of anything at all. And where we see the ones who are doing things get hit, they're usually a highly targeted company, or there's a reason why somebody may want to get into their critical assets. So that's where we're at with that portion of the video of what is a risk assessment, and then we're going to follow this guy up with another video that's going to explain types of risks and identifying things that could impact your organization, such as rogue employee, internal risks, external risks, physical risks, technical risks. I'm going to dive into that in the next video, so stay tuned.